In the north of the geography of Kurdistan, north of Lake Van, near Ursish, lies a quiet valley. Its name is Zilan. Today the only sounds in this valley are a small stream and the occasional birdsong. Few people remember that in July 1930, this same valley was the site of an unprecedented massacre. This is the story of the Zilan Massacre. It happened 8 years before Dersim and is believed by some to have claimed more lives than Dersim. Yet history has almost never written about it. From the founding of the Turkish Republic until 1938, the northern part of Kurdistan was shaken by 18 uprisings. 17 of them took place in this geography. 16 directly involved the Kurdish people. After the Sheikh said rebellion broke out in 1925 and was crushed, the Turkish government prepared the reform plan for the East. Article 17 of this plan was explicit. Speaking Kurdish was to be absolutely forbidden. Article 9 called for the forced relocation of anyone believed to have led the rebellion, along with their relatives and tribal leaders, to the western provinces. A law passed in 1927 expanded the scope of these deportations even further. In 1927, Kurds declared an independent republic of Ararat around Mount Ararat. The movement's military leader was İnsan Nuri Pasha, a former Ottoman officer. In December 1929, the Turkish cabinet, under the chairmanship of Mustafa Kemal, decided to launch a major military operation against Mount Ararat in June 1930. In June 1930, the state took a further step. Law number 0550 was enacted. This law declared that between June 20 and December 10, 1930, any killing of Kurds or any action taken against them individually or collectively by state representatives, military or civilian officials, village guards, or any civilian in the course of suppressing the rebellion would not be considered a crime. This was a massacre, legalized in advance. On July 8, 1930, the Turkish Army's 7th and 9th Corps, supported by a fleet of 80 aircraft, launched what the state itself called a cleansing operation. The Kurdish people living on their own land in the Zilan Valley had nothing to do with the rebellion. Some were not even aware it was happening, but the army treated the entire Kurdish population of the valley as the enemy. On the night of July 12 to 13, 1930, people gathered from between 10 and 15 villages were brought to the bank of the Zilan River. According to a surviving witness, villagers were tied to one another and lined up along the riverbank. Soldiers positioned on the hill above opened fire on the people waiting below. The testimony of a soldier who was forced to take part in the killing reveals how the chain of command operated. Privates were placed at the machine guns. Behind them stood corporals and sergeants with their rifles aimed at the privates. Behind them stood officers with loaded pistols ready to fire. If the privates did not shoot, the corporals and sergeants would be shot. If they did not shoot either, the officers would shoot them, and the privates too. The triggers were pulled. Thousands of bullets tore into the people in the river. The cries of women, children, and the elderly echoed through the valley. After a while, the cries turned into moans. According to witnesses, those who were not shot were killed with bayonets. Not even infants were spared. Eyewitness Kakil Erdem recounted that 35 of his relatives were killed and that soldiers cut open the abdomen of a pregnant woman. Another witness, Osman Ileri, described what he saw with his own eyes. Soldiers tore open a pregnant woman's stomach, removed the baby, and placed it on her chest. The soldiers had been betting among themselves on the sex of the child. Some villages were burned entirely. The story of the village of Burhan is remembered this way. Its residents were locked inside their homes and burned alive. One survivor recalled that day by the smell of burned bodies and the sound of people burning. The operation was completed within 4 days. On the morning of July 13, 1930, Cumhuriyet, the most widely read newspaper of the time, ran a headline that read, "The sweeping has begun. All those in the Zilan Valley have been exterminated." None of them survived. According to Cumhuriyet's edition of July 16, 1930, around 15,000 people had been killed, and the Zilan River was filled with bodies all the way to its mouth. This was the figure given by the official, state-aligned press of the time, but the number given by survivors and their descendants is far higher. Witnesses and local sources put the death toll at between 45,000 and 55,000. 44 villages were burned to the ground. Survivors were also exiled, and their property and land were seized by the state. A British Foreign Office report from the period is also revealing. It noted the conviction that the Turkish army's success near Ursaich and Zilan had really been achieved over a small number of armed men and a large proportion of non-combatants. Unlike Dersim, the story of this massacre was almost never told. In 1948, Kurdish intellectual Musa Antar, together with friends, published a journal in which he spoke for the first time about the massacres at Zilan, Dersim, and the 33 Bullets massacre. Writer Yasher Kemal learned of Zilan during interviews in the 1950s and was deeply affected by it. In 1978, his novel, The Sea-Crossed Fisherman, carried traces of this massacre through one of its characters. In 2007, two journalists working for the Dikal news agency interviewed 94-year-old eyewitness Kakil Erdem and published the interview under the title, Witness of the Zilan Massacre Speaks. The Van Second Criminal Court tried the journalists for inciting hatred and hostility for publishing this interview. In 2009, both journalists were sentenced to 18 months in prison. Remembering a massacre, even 80 years later, could still be treated as a crime by this state. In 2012, the residents of the village of Hassan Abdal in the Zilan Valley built a memorial of white boulders at the site of the killings, entirely at their own expense. Qasem Shahin, a survivor of the massacre, had stayed alive that day by hiding beneath the corpses. He returned to his own land in the 1980s once the state allowed people back. According to Qasem Shahin's grandson, everyone gathered from between 10 and 15 villages was brought to this single spot and shot. Soldiers fired down from the hill above as they watched. The river ran red. When a researcher asked how many people had visited the memorial, the grandson's answer was simple. You are the only one. A year ago, a man from the government came, took a few photographs, and left without speaking to anyone. Today, no road sign on the way to the Zilan Valley mentions its name. The signs point only to a nearby thermal resort. In 2020, the Kurdish broadcaster Rudar released a documentary titled The Red Sky, the Zilan Massacre, based on interviews conducted between 2014 and 2015. It was one of the first serious efforts to record the voices of the last surviving witnesses. To this day, there is no settled agreement on how many people died in Zilan. The official press of the time put the number at 15,000. Surviving witnesses and local sources put it at between 45,000 and 55,000. This gap is not merely a matter of statistics. It is a measure of how a state writes and conceals its own history. What happened in Zilan was a warning of what would be repeated 8 years later in Dersim, the same legal mechanism, the same military method, the same silence. Today, the memorial of white boulders standing on the bank of the Zilan River was not built by the state, but by the villagers themselves with their own hands. Official history still does not speak its name. But every July, in that valley where the river still flows, the story of the Kurdish people lost 96 years ago still lives on in the memory of a small number of people who refuse to forget.